Hi, good morning, everyone. So let us discuss communication ethics. All right. So in the previous lesson, you read or you learned about some sort of introduction to communication. So in this lesson, you will find out that there are different guidelines in communicating in an ethical manner. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to know how to communicate in an ethical manner and apply these ethical principles to your communication process. So it is important to understand that whatever we communicate, we should be guided by certain um, ethical principles. Let me have my next slide. Ayan. All right, so the U.S. National Communication Association, or NCA, discusses this in their Credo for Ethical Communication, stating that ethical communication is, fundamental to responsible thinking, decision making, and the development of relationships and communities within and across contexts, cultures, channels, and media. So, moreover, ethical communication enhances human worth and dignity by fostering truthfulness, fairness, responsibility, personal integrity, and respect for self and others. We believe that an ethical communication threatens all the quality or all the quality rather of all communication and consequently that well-being of individuals in the society in which we live. So in the credo, there are three or four ethical principles of communication that are especially relevant for students like you nowadays. Firstly, they advocate accuracy, truthfulness, honesty, and reason as essential to the integrity of communication. So nowadays, social media and speeches in public have been so filled with black propaganda and whitewashing that there is a call to reiterate the need for truth and honesty. I don't know if you could observe that, but that is really happening. It is important to be accurate when we communicate and to have facts and figures as always, no? To prove our assertions or our views or our stand. It is important to be reasonable rather than to be too emotional or threatening when we communicate. Okay? Next. Secondly, the NCA also endorses freedom of expression, diversity of perspective, and tolerance of dissent to achieve the informed and responsible decision making fundamental to a civil society. In a certain political climate, people may feel threatened to the point that they no longer feel that it is safe to express what they feel or think. This is not a good environment to live in. We fully agree with NCA that to have a vibrant democracy, we must be able to hear different perspectives and have a high tolerance for view that are different from ours. It is also important to foster an environment where people feel safe enough to express what they think and feel, and for these expressions to be met with reasonable dialogue and debate rather than outright censure or violence. Okay. Thirdly, yeah, the third one states that they condemn and that degrades they condemn a communication that degrades individuals and humanity through distortion, intimidation, coercion, and violence, and through the expression of intolerance and hatred. So this condemnation is important because it safeguards no, society from racism, sexism, and violence against oppressed peoples. History has shown us that tolerance for hate speech, as well as speeches that incite violence and act of killing, have often instituted such violence in society, whether this is in context of slavery, colonialism, or misogyny. Lastly, mga anak, the NCA states that communicators should accept, okay, responsibility for the short and long-term consequences of our communication and expect the same from others. All too often, okay, there have been, people who do not feel accountable for their actions, and that's very sad. Therefore, if one risks to communicate maliciously or spread false news or incite, hatred or violence, he or she'd be ready to face the consequences of such actions. States are beginning to realize this, especially in the porous medium of social media, even here in the Philippines, right? We are seeing that, people who are victims of malicious acts or malicious speech, hatred speech, no, those people aren't silent anymore. No, they stand in order for them to let those oppressors realize that whatever they do needs to have a consequence to face. Okay, so every time we communicate, we should consider the consequences of our actions. If people were more responsible in their use of communication, there would be less conflict in this world. I don't know if you agree, but me, I highly agree with this. Even though the four principles above are short and concise, they are important because they help, or they help us discern the difference between ethical and unethical communicators. So my question for all of you, no, why is this important to be ethical in communicating today? Yeah. So is honesty still a virtue value today? Why or why not? Okay. So let's proceed to the next one. And communication and globalization. So by the end of this discussion, it is expected that you understand the implications of globalization and communication, explain the notion of world Englishes in the context of English being a global language, and use standard English and bias-free language in writing. Okay, so globalization has led to um has led us, has, sorry, communication is or has affected us rather, no, so sorry for that. Okay, affected us in numerous ways, diba? Like airfare has become cheaper and one can travel internationally more than one could in the past. Many Filipinos have decided to work or live abroad, with some of them migrating to the other countries. Free trade of goods and services all over the world has brought multinational companies and foreign investors to our stores. Because all of these factors, it is imperative. Okay, it is really required, or we are really required to be aware on the differences between our culture and the rest of the world's culture. As you observe, no, like um everything or everyone is open now with interaction, with the other countries, be it some sort of vacation, trades, services, or for a living. Because of the advent of the internet, the world seems to have been shrinking continually. One can communicate internationally in a matter of sending a text message. Do you agree? Like even with the chat, no, you could go ahead and do talk to someone outside of our country, like, having friends, no, or even having some sort of romantic relationship with other people from the other country. That's really possible, no, nowadays. One can read about different cultures and have access to films, academic papers, and like from other countries around the world and vice versa. Given this is increasingly shrinking world, One should know the difference between the kind of English that we write and speak and the kind of Englishes that exist outside of the Philippines. I remember I read this somewhere. I forgot the website or the book, but it says that, or it is a question telling that if English is the language that we speaks all over the world, what what other things can go wrong? Diba? And I also discovered that we are speaking English or different Englishes around the country or around the world. No? So the English that we practice here in the Philippines is somehow different from the English that other people outside of the country practices. And that is called as the world Englishes. All right. David Crystal 2003 begins the first chapter of the book, English as a Global Language, with the assertion that English is, in fact, the global language. After giving various examples to support that statement, no, he questions the assertion by asking, what does it mean to say that a language is global? Right? In this, he considers the implications of English having this status, especially for its many users who speak different mother tongues, just like us here in the Philippines. So, in the story of English by Robert Macrom et al., it discusses the success story of the rise of English. They also provide a variety of examples that demonstrate the global presence of English. The question that follow help the reader to explore more implications of language wide range. So we're not gonna do the activity since this one is a this one needs a face-to-face interaction, and we are dealing with a virtual one. So let's just have that when our when the time I mean when we are gonna have our face-to-face interaction. But let us go back to the readings in the world Englishes by Crystal. Okay. So we have this literature, no, that speaks about the story of English, no, or speaks about the English language, no. So the ones that I have mentioned a while back, the story of English, but by Robert Macrum, I have here the summary of it, no. So I just want to share about that in order for you to know, do you have, I mean, in order for you to have some sort of ideas about that as well. So the first paragraph of that the first paragraph of that write up, no, sabi dito, the rise of English is a remarkable success story. When Julius Caesar landed in Britain nearly 2,000 years ago, English did not exist. 500 years later, English, incomprehensible to modern ears, was probably spoken by about as few people as currently speak Cherokee, and with about as little influence. Nearly 1,000 years later, at the end of 16th century, when William Shakespeare was in his prime, English was the native speech of between 5 to 7 million Englishmen, and it was, in the words of a contemporary, a small reach. It stretcheth no further than this island of ours, nigh not their overall. Yeah, ganun siya sinabi. Okay. The final paragraph would be the emergence of English as a global phenomenon as either first, second, or foreign language has recently inspired the idea that we should talk not of English but of many Englishes, especially in the third world countries, whereas or where use of English is no longer part of the colonial legacy but the result of decisions made since their independence, just like what happened here in the Philippines. Throughout the history of English, there has been a contest between the forces of standardization and the forces of localization at both the written and spoken levels. The appearance of the first substantial English dictionaries in the 18th century was a move towards written standardization. It was Victoria, England, that realized the idea of the Queen's English, a spoken standard to which the lesser breeds could aspire. The Industrial Revolution meant roads, canals, and above all, trains. People traveled more both geographically and socially. The pressures of class ambitions speeded the emergence of standard form of English speech. Okay, so it is also being said, no, that when you say English, it has its varieties, no. So all of the varieties are equal, no, in a sense that each is best suited to the communication needs of its speakers. Okay, but however, not all are equal in prestige. Okay. Some varieties are more prestigious than others because of social attitudes about the speakers of these varieties. So even in the language, no, there is this discrimination. For example, in the social variety of English called African American English or AAE, used by many but not all African Americans in different regions of the USA. Certain features such as the J dropping in words like written or reading, no, walking, and singing are stigmatized. No, the process of stigmatization follows a regular pattern whereby the social practices, especially speech of dominated groups such as African Americans, are treated as abnormal by those dominant groups who are in charge of defining normal. That's according to Yule 2010. Some scholars, like Rouhani Tupes and Rabdi way back in 2015, use term unequal Englishes to focus discussions of the unequal ways and situations in which Englishes are arranged, configured, and contested. Can you imagine that? No, like even in the speaking of the English language, there is this discrimination, there is this stigmatization, right? Um, It is also important for writers from a post-colonial context, such as Philippines, no, which has a conflicted historical relationship with English, to be aware of the political forces, not just economic ones. So, guiding their use of the language. So, the two most well-known varieties of English are those of colonial superpowers. Who are they? Definitely, um, ayan. Right. Definitely those are the British English and then American English. No, but there are many multilingual countries around the world in which varieties of English have developed. This may be because English was initially transported to that country by English speaking settlers, as in the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Like it could also be that English may have been brought to that country as language of contest by English speaking colonizers, as in South Africa, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines. The latter countries, English's particular role as official language. Here in the Philippines, English is one of our official languages. Medium of instruction, no, in the academe we use English as the medium of instruction, or even language of law and government, diba? In our law, diba, English is the language being used, diba, with the provisions, no, and even with some speeches that we could hear, diba, from some government officers and the likes. All right. Okay, as we continue, English is also studied as foreign language in some non-English speaking countries such as Holland and Yugoslavia, as mentioned earlier by Macron. Okay, and in Korea, of course, and Japan, that's the reason why they are enrolling in some how do you call this one? Tutorial services. No, they are looking for that. Okay. So in these countries, there is less exposure to English and is often learned for career progression because it is the language of international business. I know that you know that, of course. As mentioned earlier, all of these world Englishes are equal in functionality, but not are all equal in prestige. The idea, however, in writing is to adhere to the standard English of one's country because each variety, including those of the United States and United Kingdom, has its own peculiar or individual features. Those features includes the spelling, punctuation, favored words and expressions, and sometimes grammatical constructions, diba? So the table that we have right now gives an example of some of these differences for American English and British English. Kindly take note. Yeah, let's continue. Yan. For Philippine English, diba, has its unique and idiosyncratic usages. So when you say idiosyncratic, it's unique, it's peculiar. For example, comfort room is a Philippine term for washroom, right? Toilets or lavatory. When Filipino says there's traffic, they mean there's heavy traffic. Diba? Instead of saying traffic jam, because that's the correct word for that one. Moreover, the word salvage in the Philippine context can mean either to save or the very common to brutally murder, usually for political reasons. Diba? Brought murder brutally. Diba? Matthew Sutherland, who wrote about Philippine English from an Englishman's perspective, talks about the expression for a while, which he says baffles foreigners because the expression does not exist outside of the Philippines. Diba? For a while. There's no such thing pala outside of the country. The UK's equivalent, he says, is just a second or just a moment. But here in the Philippines, it's for a while. Similarly, Sutherland notes that for a while is frequently used in the Philippines on the telephone, whereas in the UK, the more typical expression would be hold on or hang on, quoted in Aguilar 2004. Importantly, he mentions that this British idiomatic equivalent would just be as baffling to those unfamiliar with these usages. Filipinos might, sorry, Filipinos, might, in response to being told to hang on, may very well will ask, hang on to what? Diba? Because we're not used of it. Sutherland also notes that every English speaking nation has its own set of English, how do they call this one? Speaking nation, sorry, Sutherland also notes that every English speaking nation has its own set of English phrases and idioms. No? So, sabi niya, English is equally idiosyncratic or peculiar in let's say India, Jamaica, Zimbabwe or Singapore. Singapore. In other words, there is no wrong way of speaking English as long as those people who speak it understand each other. Okay? So, in fact, the fact that all varieties of English have individual or peculiar usages is why it is important in the context of academic and professional writing. Okay. And with that being said, we need to follow a certain standard. Okay. All right. Hold on. Okay, going back. Where was I? Yeah. Yeah. So Sutherland also mentioned that the many versions of English spoken around the globe merely serve to have or to make English as an even richer tongue. However, just like what I mentioned a while back, the fact that all varieties of English have individual or peculiar usages is why it is important in the context of academic and professional writing to follow a standard. Okay, the standard advocates, the use of a consistent spelling and punctuation system. It also avoids colloquial. It also avoids colloquial and informal usages. And um, it becomes necessary to use in writing as well. So the label for this variety is standard English, or depending on the region, standard American English, standard British English, or standard Philippine English. This is defined as consisting of the conventional vocabulary and usage of educated speakers and writers of English, according to Roberts and Turgeon way back to 1998. To use this kind of English means to follow a spelling or punctuation system that is consistent with a prescribed standard. For example, standard Philippine English follows standard American usages for spelling, punctuation, and formatting of dates. In terms of grammar and diction, standard English does not include slang, vulgarisms, regionalisms, and other constrictions that are considered unorthodox by those seeking a language acceptable to a general audience. So, in general, then writers should avoid local idioms, expressions, and constructions like those examples being mentioned, and especially to use words no that will be clearly understood by English speakers from any region of the world. So in summary, in everyday speech and informal context, one is free to use his or her own variety of English. However, in more formal writing context, one should be able to identify which features of variety may not be understood by other speakers of English and to use alternatives that will be understood by a wider audience. Okay, so let's continue. Yan. So, talking about globalization, there is really a need for us as well to be culturally sensitive and bias free in using a language. So, just as important as awareness to existence of word Englishes, okay, um, is that of practicing cultural sensitivity. To write in culturally sensitive way means to be aware that cultural differences and similarities between people exist and that this should not be assigned a positive or negative value via words and descriptions selected in writing. Um, Academic and professional writings are characterized by bias-free language. So you need to be aware of that as well. Students, scholars, professionals, and anyone wishing to maintain harmonious communicative relations should be careful in using words and phrases that do not discriminate against particular groups, whether in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, social class, age, and disability. Take note of those. The essential point is to communicate in a way that is respectful of diversity or differences. So here are some general principles to follow when referring to different groups or categories. So starting with the race and ethnicity. Racism is a form of discrimination against a person or persons of a different race. In general, it is best to avoid identifying people by race or ethnic group. Race is an emotionally charged topic, so it is best to tread carefully with the language used and to refer to race as according to Patricia Arinto. Okay. Um Asserts in English for the professions, only if it is relevant to what you have to say. Words that reinforce stereotypes and that imply all people of a particular race or ethnic group are same should be avoided. For example, although the assessment is positive in the sentence, naturally the Asian students won the math contest. The word naturally reinforces the stereotype or generalization that Asians have super or superior aptitude in math. Can you understand that? Like we should avoid stereotyping. Okay. Next, one must be attuned or be careful to the current terminology by which racial and ethnic groups refer themselves. This may be done reading national papers and watching television news, which typically are good indicators of current and preferred usage. According to Kitty Locker and Donna Kensler, 2013, one should refer to a group by the term it prefers, which means some research is required to find out about acceptable and preferred terms. For example, for a long time, Native American, no, the term Native American, um, has been considered the politically correct term for the indigenous peoples of the Americas over the label Red Indian. No, but today, most Native American people prefer to be referred to by their specific nation or tribe. In the Philippine context, there have been shifts in the preferences for terms that Filipinos of Chinese ancestry used to describe their identity from Chino to Chinoy to Filipino Chinese. It is also important to be sensitive to religion. Take note. You know, when referring to various ethnic groups, assumptions should not be made that stereotype a race, nationality, or ethnic group with a specific region. For example, not all Arabs are Muslims, not all Indians are Buddhists, and not all Filipinos are Roman Catholics. Okay, take note of that. Next one would be the gender and then the sexual orientation. Sexism refers to the prejudice and discrimination based on sex or gender. To be inclusive of all people in general references, okay, one should favor gender neutral words and phrases over gender biased words. Example, rather than man made, one can say manufactured or synthetic or artificial. Instead of saying layman's term, one can use ordinary terms. Neutral words should also be chosen over words with man and woman in job titles or descriptions. Like, for example, it is more appropriate to use chairperson in replace to chairman. Diba? Flight attendant in place of stewardess because there are male stewardess, right? And labor in place of manpower. One should also avoid sexist terms like woman lawyer, male nurse, and simply use lawyer and nurse. Okay. Pronouns may also be gendered bias. For example, when the masculine he pronoun is used as a genetic one for both genders, gender bias pronouns can be avoided by first one, dropping nouns or dropping pronouns that signify gender and restating the sentence. B, changing to plural construction. And C, replacing masculine or feminine pronouns with one or you. So we have that here. Diba? We could restate, no? To avoid giving pronouns. We could pluralize it, no? Just like with the example that we have here. Or you could just simply use the term pronoun you. Okay. Other gender related terms may have to do with gender orientation or sexual orientation. It is important to be sensitive to new attitudes about homosexual, transsexual, and transgender people. For example, most gay people prefer the term gay to the more clinical homosexual as a label. Lesbian is currently the term preferred by a gay woman. Transgender people prefer to be referred as being the gender they identify as, not their birth gender. Again, as a matter of principle, one should refer to suicidal groups in the way that members of this group prefer to be referred to. Note also the terminology in this area is developing and that not everyone agrees. Okay, that's the truth here in our country, right? All right, next, the social discrimination. Class discrimination or classism is a form of prejudice against a person or people because of their social class. An example of language with bias against class is the American term white trash, which is not only a racial slur but a classist one that refers to white people, usually from rural southern United States, coming from lower social class inside the white population. The term is negative, not just because of the words that comprise it, but because of its connotation of danger. White trash people are seen as criminals, unpredictable, and without respect for authority. In the United States, other cultures, there may also be kind of racism against those who are economically privileged, and that's sad. The rich are sometimes referred by the derogatory terms preppy or yuppie, both of which connote with not just wealth but arrogance. There are examples from the Philippine culture as well in the informal terms konyo and jologs, both derogatory terms referring to class. The first used to describe young people from the upper class who speak in idiosyncratic mix of English and Tagalog, no, the konyo, connotes vanity and consciousness about social status. The second, now perhaps replaced by the term judgment, as used in reference to an idiosyncratic spelling or writing style used to describe persons who look poor and out of style. Saan kayo sa dalawa? Classism may also appear even in more formal terminology. No, the sociologist or activist Betsy Leander Wright argues in a video interview that classist terms attribute favorable traits to the wealthy and power, and those in poverty or near poverty are similarly cast in a negative light. A more sensitive vocabulary terms that more precisely portray the actual circumstances of people with a class structure. For example, instead of the owning class, one can use the upper class and the privileged class. And instead of the underclass, one can say less privileged or describe a condition of chronic poverty. In Philippines, informal settlers is now the more politically correct term for squatters. All right. Next would be the age. Ageism is a form of discrimination against other people because of their age, assuming that older people are less physically, intellectually, and emotionally able than other age groups. The capabilities of younger people should, also not be misunderestimated on the basis of their age. Again, it is important to refer to a person's age only when that information is pertinent to what is being discussed. When referring to a genetic group, one should ask their subjects what words they prefer. Do they wish to be called as older persons or senior citizens? Do they prefer to the label youths, teenagers, or young people? Lastly, according to American Psychological Association, writers should be specific when referring to males and females in terms of their age. Females 18 years or older are women, not girls. Girls refer those in high school younger under 18. The same is true for boys and men. Next one would be the disability. Is a very common one. Discrimination in this area often arises because of the lack of understanding and awareness. Therefore, first, it is important to distinguish same terms that are mistakenly understood to be synonymous. Various guides on bias-free communication and often confused terminology are available online. No? It's free. Okay. One example is a guide to bias-free communications published by the University of Wisconsin Madison. It defines the terms impairment, disability, and handicap as respectively a psychological condition. Then we also have the consequence of an impairment, which may or may not be handicapping, and then the social implication of disability, a condition or barrier imposed by society, the environment, or oneself. That's why, according to these definitions, a limp is an impairment in which a leg or foot is damaged or stiff. As a disability that may result from arthritis is difficulty in walking or walking unevenly and haltingly. People who limp may be handicapped by having to climb stairs in buildings with no elevators. Other guides from other cultural contexts may provide different definitions and examples. Well, the bottom line is we need to be aware, with those such, um, with those such, how do you call this one? With those such terms. Okay. Finally, when referring to people with disabilities, the focus should be on the person, not the condition, according to Arinto 2009. In Patricia Arinto's English for Professions, she advises writers to avoid hurtful expressions such as retards or retarded, or even seemingly neutral description, the mentally retarded, and to use instead people with mental retardation, similarly um people with vision impairments, or sorry, similarly, instead of blind and cancer patients, one should instead use people with vision impairments and people being treated for cancer respectively. Okay, note that um there should also be, when we write it or when we deliver a certain passage about them or message about them, note that there should be some difference in sentences. Like for example, um the first one or the first example would be the blind student used a special keyboard during the exam sounds harsh, right? But if we're gonna have the student first or the person first before the disability, it could be somehow neutral. Like the student who is visually impaired used a special keyboard during exam. Diba? Another thing is that um Arinto also suggests considering the negative implications of usage, such as confined to a wheelchair and AIDS victim. Diba? For the former, one should instead write or say uses a wheelchair because wheelchairs enable people to escape confinement. Well, for the latter, one should use person with AIDS as someone who can acquire a disease without being victimized by it. Um, it also notes that the word abnormal may be replaced with atypical because people who have disabilities are atypical but not necessarily abnormal. These latter examples demonstrate the importance of not representing people with disabilities as unfortunate, limited, and helpless victims. Okay, and that's it. Thank you.